season starts here, the Vancouver Boat Show.
Welcome to the Vancouver International Boat Show virtual seminar series, sponsored by Freedom Marine International Yacht Sales, the premier choice for exploring the passion of yachting. Thank you for joining us. The seminar will begin in one moment. If you are having technical difficulties, you can reach me, the online moderator, via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions for the speaker can be added to the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen. We will answer these questions at the end of the presentation. Now it is our pleasure to present Offshore Personal Survival Training with David Sutcliffe. Welcome for joining us, David.
Thanks very much, Braden, and good afternoon to everyone. A most interesting year we're having this year with not being able to get together in person, but I'm very happy to be able to do this webinar online and share it with you, and I look forward to questions and discussion at the end. With that, I guess we'll get underway. And I want to just say, first of all, that, oh, hang on a second, we're going to get our screen to move. Okay, so my background is both racing and cruising, mostly Pacific Ocean, as far as Australia, and a little bit past that into Indonesia and the eastern part of the next ocean over. And what I'm going to do today is basically get into talking about training, experience and training leading up to offshore sailing. Now, offshore sailing means different things to different people. And I know that Jim Innes in an earlier seminar at the boat show here has talked about going offshore to do an event like the Vic Maui International Yacht Race. And yesterday, Christoph Marty talked about how to get the boat ready to go offshore. So today I'd just like to talk about, well, what does offshore mean and what kind of training and experience do we want to have when we go to our first really big offshore passage? World Sailing describes offshore sailing as passages, whether they're races or cruises, of long distance and well offshore, a real focus on self-sufficiency, capable of withstanding heavy storms, and that's whether or not those are seasonal in the passage you're planning on. Ready to handle serious emergencies. And because there's no urban 911 out there, without the expectation of getting outside help, or at least not getting it quickly. So that's offshore sailing for this discussion. And what we're going to do in this seminar, I've got about 40 minutes of remarks and visuals to show you. What we can do in an hour is talk about some of the key risks in offshore waters, and then highlight training methods and programs to address these risks. Just to be clear, what we really can't do in less than an hour is do the actual training. And now I know everyone knows that, but at the end of 40 minutes or an hour, there's no certificate. There might be an attaboy. Okay, so offshore risks, what are the big risks when you head offshore? And I would group them in three major areas. One is risks to the crew, to people. Another is risks to the boat. And the third, of course, is environmental risks, the things that go on around us that we don't necessarily control once we're underway. A lot of these risks are common to coastal sailing, but there's two key differences that I want to highlight. One is your boat and your crew will be sailing 24 hours a day for probably many days on a significant offshore passage. And that adds up to a tremendous amount more wear and tear on the boat and the crew than doing short weekend style trips in coastal waters. The second thing is, unlike coastal waters, or most coastal waters in our part of the world, we can't rely on outside help coming quickly if we get into trouble. And so, although help may and will eventually come, it might not be as fast as we wish we could get it under the circumstances. And the help that comes might not be able to do everything. So those are two key differences compared to coastal sailing, where help's readily at hand and major resources are readily at hand, at least in areas like BC's coastal waters, South Coast in particular, with the proximity to urban areas and urban resources. So our goal offshore, because of those two key differences, has to be that we maximize self-reliance and minimize our dependency on calling for outside help. So what kind of training? I think there's really three broad kinds of training. I'm going to touch on the first two briefly, and then we'll dive into the offshore personal survival formal training as a particular area. But the three basic kinds of training are, experience-based, self-guided, and the formal training programs. I think it's fair to say that most of us, sailors in general, are going to gain most of our sailing experience as on-the-job training. We're going to gain it incrementally over a period of time. And when people think about when coastal sailors think about going and sailing offshore, I think the key thing we want to emphasize is you want to build your experience gradually. It's not really realistic to say I'm going to go from being a dinghy sailor out of Jericho in English Bay to I'm going to skipper a large keelboat offshore for a few 1,000-mile race or passage. So there has to be some steps in between. And we don't want the very first time we sail in gale force winds, or the first time we sail overnight, or the first time we sail in very difficult sea states. We don't want those first times to all come when we're on our first offshore passage, because frankly, that would be overwhelming. It's too steep of a learning curve. So people often ask, well, okay, I've sailed for years in coastal waters. I want to do a major offshore passage. What do I need to do to get ready? And I think the key things are you need to have a progression of skills as a crew member where you've developed an understanding of key jobs on the boat, whether that's sail trim or helming or navigation or other roles. And if you're going to skipper a boat, you've got to understand the difference between skippering a boat at daytime in the Strait of Georgia and skippering about 500 miles offshore at night in a developing heavy weather situation. They are going to be different. You're going to want to build that experience gradually. In particular, once you get to overnight passages and then longer overnight passages, you can't have the whole crew awake all the time, 24 hours a day. And so you'll get into watch systems where part of the crew's on duty at one part of the time and the rest of the crew's resting, and they switch off through different watches. And that's really how we manage multi-day passages in offshore areas. So those kind of things are things you're going to build up to. The second kind of learning beyond experience-based learning, which we all do, is self-guided learning. And here, sailing's kind of the perfect example of a pursuit in life where you're going to be learning your whole life for as long as you sail. I've never met a sailor who knew everything about sailing, and I've done a lot of sailing myself, and I know I don't know everything about sailing. Every time I do a new or different kind of sailing, I learn something, and I expect that to keep happening for as long as I sail. So for the technical topics in sailing, the things you aren't just going to learn hands-on on a boat while you're sailing, for example, how a rig's set up and tuned, how sails are set up for heavy weather conditions, how to do a crew overboard rescue, and those kinds of things that are not going to be day-to-day things in sailing. You're going to want to do some self-guided learning. You want to learn the basics yourself, so you know something, and very importantly, so you know what you don't know. And then you want to deepen your learning by getting experts in, either on your crew or into sessions, training sessions, or other things you put together with the experts on your boat. So, for example, running a crew overboard practice session on the water, on your boat with your crew. that's a great time to bring in a coach or an instructor who's experienced at doing that, because they'll be able to show you different techniques, help you figure out which techniques work best with your boat and your crew and the conditions you're sailing in, and also critique you and help you develop and get better at it. So that's really the self-guided part of learning. And there are lots of people around, some of whom are keen on helping people out and introducing them to offshore sailing. And that brings us to formal training. And here I'll touch on just 3 examples. Formal training programs as you get ready to head offshore. One is the Offshore Personal Survival Program. Another would be a specialized course on weather and routing. And a third example would be first aid program oriented or tailored for heading offshore. Now, those are just 3 examples. There's lots of other training programs, but those are things that are going to be the focus of this discussion. So now on offshore personal survival training, this particular genre of training is standardized around the world. It has its curriculum set by World Sailing, and training organizations and instructors are accredited by each sailing national authority. So in Canada, that's Sail Canada. And offshore personal survival training is offered by accredited instructors in BC. You can get information on that from BC Sailing and local clubs. And I'll have this information up again at the end of the presentation. If you're coming into this seminar from outside of BC, across Canada, it's offered in a number of provinces across Canada by various training providers. And the information on those training providers and courses is available at the Sail Canada link at the bottom of the screen. So, what's in an offshore personal survival training program? Well, as I mentioned, World Sailing sets the required curriculum, and it covers all of the topics that are up on the screen here. Now, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I will touch through most of them with some very quick examples in a moment. These training topics are embedded in World Sailing's offshore special regulations. And that's a set of regulations that have been developed over, safety regulations that have been developed over several decades, and through both experience and, sadly, accidents that sailors have been involved in events and passages around the world. Compliance with the offshore special regulations is actually required for most offshore racing events. And even if you're not a racer, the body of knowledge, the regulations that are based on actual experience and actual accidents that's put together in the offshore special regulations, extremely useful as you think about how to prepare your boat, how to prepare your crew, and make sure you're fully ready to go. So let's talk about a few of those topics. One of the key things is personal safety gear. And here you can expect you'll be using more personal safety gear and a more robust or capable set of personal safety gear than you might use in coastal waters. That starts with rule number 1, which is always stay on the boat. Once we get off the boat into the water, a bunch of other rules kick in, but rule number 1, stay on the boat, prevent crew overboard situations. So some of the equipment relates to keeping you on the boat. If you do end up in the water, flotation equipment personal flotation equipment, both to give you flotation and to protect your ability to breathe and not be ingesting seawater. You'll have signaling and communications equipment, everything from very low-tech things like whistles through possibly handheld VHF radios, right up to high-tech equipment like personal locator beacons or AIS locator beacons. We cover the care and maintenance of the safety equipment. So when you do a course like the Offshore Personal Survival course, you bring your own PFD, your own safety gear, and you bring that gear whether it's exactly the gear you plan to go offshore with or not, because in the training environment, we want to train with our own gear. And we want to learn our gear, learn what works about it, and also what doesn't work about it. In care and maintenance, we learn how to do the regular inspections and maintenance on the equipment to make sure it's actually going to work when we really need it to. Another area of focus for this class of training is fire. Now in fire, we start with theory. Many of you may already be familiar with some basic fire theory, the fire triangle on the top left or the fire tetrahedron on the top right. And the fire theory describes what are the different things that have to come together to allow a fire to get started and for a fire to keep burning. We learn about that theory so that we know how to prevent those things from coming together and prevent fires from happening in the first place. We also learn about the equipment used in fighting fire, different types of fire extinguishers, different types of extinguishing equipment, and which equipment's best to be used for what kind of fires. This can be a mix of both theory and practical learning, as is the case with a number of the topics. So you may never look at the fire extinguisher on your boat quite the same again after you've been through this module. Now, crew overboard, I already mentioned that once or twice. We believe the rule number one of crew overboard is stay on the boat. Everything after that, once somebody's off the boat in the water, has risk and challenges and variables, and those are hard to control in coastal waters, and they can be very difficult to control in offshore waters. It doesn't take very much distance in offshore conditions until, because of wave height, waves or swell, you can't even see your crew member in the water anymore. So it's really important to stay on the boat. We've spent a bunch of time on both equipment to help the crew stay on the boat, but also good practices or technique to help the crew stay on the boat. That's the prevention side of it. When prevention fails, you've got to be able to get back to that crew member, and you've got to be able to recover them back onto the boat. And I think it's fair to say that many of us are familiar with some crew overboard recovery methods. Some of us train with one of those methods regularly. And the hard truth in my own experience is that most man overboard or crew overboard training involves throwing a floatable object overboard and going through the maneuvers to maneuver the boat back to that floating object, and then recovering it with a boat hook, and everybody high-fiving each other on what a great job they did and how quickly they got back and got the floating seat cushion back on the boat. The problem is getting back to the person who's overboard is only the first half of a very challenging problem offshore. The second half is getting the person back on the boat. And in anything but calm waters and in ideal conditions, that can be a real challenge. And so we spend a fair bit of time focused on what I'll call the second half of crew overboard, which is getting, once you've gotten back to the person and got them to the boat, how to actually get somebody who started out weighing 120 or 150 or 200 pounds and is now soaking wet and wearing full gear and a life jacket, how to get that heavy, wet, and perhaps incapacitated person back on the boat. So that's something. It's a tough subject to work on because it involves, it's a risk to real people, and we spend a fair bit of time on that to make sure we're going to be ready to go on that. A related topic to crew overboard is hypothermia and cold water immersion. Now, I think it's fair to say that a long time ago, at least in my life, a long time ago when somebody died, it was usually said that they died of exposure. If they died outdoors in the environment, they died of exposure. And over time, we all learned that, well, no, that you don't die. Exposure is very poorly defined. What is that? people die of hypothermia. And it's actually, it's clear that hypothermia is a real killer, especially in conditions where people can be cold and wet. But it turns out that a lot of people who end up in the water, in cold water, they die or drown before they get really hypothermic, and they drown from the effects of cold water immersion. And so in the Offshore Personal Survival Program, we talk about crew overboard, we talk about getting the person back on the boat, and then we go into a fair bit of detail on the theory of hypothermia and cold water immersion. And we also go through a session that covers the field treatments, what you can do in the field when there isn't an ambulance 10 or 20 minutes away, there isn't an immediate outside resource to help with somebody who's suffering from cold water immersion or hypothermia. So we talk about the available field treatments. And that the idea behind that's to give us the tools, not only to get back to the person and to get them out of the water, but also to look after them after we get them back on the boat. Another topic that's always got a lot of interest is marine weather. Now, our working assumption in the offshore personal survival course is people already have a basic familiarity with coastal marine weather. What we do in the course is we focus on how do you apply that existing knowledge and extend it to offshore waters. So what kind of forecasts are available for offshore waters and oceanic waters? Who do you get those forecasts from? How do you get those forecasts onto the boat? Obviously, we're not in cellular or internet coverage when we're offshore. And so we have to figure out how are we going to get our weather forecasts. And then once we have the information on the boat, how are we actually going to interpret that information and make the decisions we need to make while we're sailing offshore? I have to say, weather in itself is the subject of many comprehensive courses. And so when you do a course like the Offshore Personal Survival course, we're providing an introduction to offshore weather. We can't go into a full course on offshore weather. And those courses are available. I'll touch on one briefly towards the end of my remarks. Another thing, it couldn't have been a real offshore sailing adventure if you don't come back with at least one story of heavy weather somewhere along the way. Whether you experience it or not, all your friends at home will demand you to tell them the stories of offshore weather. So, like some of the earlier points, offshore conditions aren't necessarily completely different than coastal conditions, but there are important differences. So I'm starting here. This image you're seeing on your screen is Beaufort Force 9 or gale force winds. This is actually in coastal waters. This is the Strait of Georgia in a Easter weekend storm. And so this is gale force gusting into storm force. And that's a 40-foot sailboat you can see. You don't see much of the hull above the swell, but it's a 40-foot sailboat in that heavy weather. Now, in offshore conditions, this is also Force 9, gale force gusting to storm force. This is a larger boat offshore off of Cape Horn. And so what we'd introduce in the course is what are heavy weather sailing techniques, both the equipment that's used, the preparation and the equipment that's used to sail in heavy weather conditions, and also the techniques for sailing in heavy weather conditions, how you look after the boat, how you protect the crew, how you get through the actual heavy weather conditions to the other side, if you will, and then how you mop up afterwards and figure out, well, what did we learn? Because you always learn something. So that's what heavy weather is about in this course. Another significant topic, a search and rescue organization. So most of us are familiar with coastal waters search and rescue. it's pretty hard not to be familiar with it in the summer months. All you have to do is be listening to Channel 16 and you'll hear an endless series of calls of people running out of gas and running aground on completely uncharted rocks and mud banks, at least not on their charts. And this, in coastal waters, we think of it mostly as it's Channel 16 and it's our local Coast Guard. And other boats that are in the area that can assist. Once you head into truly offshore waters, there is a worldwide search and rescue framework that's been adopted and is subscribed to by pretty well all the countries that have maritime borders and waters. So the chart here on the screen is how the North Pacific Ocean search and rescue regions are divided. And so if we start close to home, you'll see just west of BC's coast, west of Vancouver Island, the Central Coast, and Haida Gwaii is the Victoria Search and Rescue Region. Now, it's served by the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Victoria. Now that looks like a tiny area on this diagram, but just to be clear, that extends several hundred kilometers west of BC's mainland coast and covers an enormous body of water. It gives you an idea just how big the Pacific Ocean is, that the adjacent search and rescue areas like the Juneau area out of Alaska, the Honolulu area, which is massive, which is anchored out of Honolulu, and the two or three U.S. Coast Guard rescue regions that are organized off the west coast of the continental U.S. These cover enormous areas of ocean. And if you're leaving the Pacific Northwest and heading offshore, very quickly you're going to leave your home waters, Coast Guard focused resources and region and be into areas that are not your home waters. So in this course, we cover how do you communicate from a boat offshore with search and rescue authorities in a different search and rescue region than you're used to being in. And how do you get the help you need and what you should expect when the help arrives on scene wherever you are. Because chances are the first help that's going to get to you offshore, well offshore, is not going to be a government search and rescue vessel or aircraft. The first help that gets to you may well be a commercial ship or some other vessel of opportunity, as they're called. So that's what we're going to focus on, is how search and rescue is organized outside of coastal waters, how to get in touch with a search and rescue coordination center, and then what to expect from the help when it does arrive on scene. Now we're going to get to some of the highlights of the course. One of the highlights is clearly when we get in the water. You are going to get in the water in this course. You're going to get wet. And you'll do a variety of drills in the pool. You'll be using your own PFD, and you'll be finding out how it really works. If it's an inflatable PFD, how it inflates manually or automatically. How for any PFD, how well it fits you, what the different adjustments are. And you're going to find things out about your equipment for sure. In my experience, everybody who goes into the pool with their own PFD and their own personal safety equipment that's attached to the PFD or in their pockets is going to find out, when I'm in the water, I can't get to that pocket because it's behind me and it's underwater. Or my PFD adjustment straps, I'm having trouble adjusting them after I'm in the water. So there's a lot of learning that comes through actually taking your real safety equipment and getting in the water with it. The course supplies real life rafts, and we do real inflations of those rafts in the pool. So you'll be deploying those life rafts, inflating them. You'll board the life raft from the side of the pool as well as from the water. We'll capsize the life rafts, and you'll learn how to rewrite the life raft and reboard it. A whole series of drills in the water around the life rafts and using your own safety equipment. Uh, you'll also learn techniques in team and individual drills. If you're in the water by yourself or in a group, how do you slow down hypothermia? How do you delay the onset of hypothermia? How do you keep everybody together? And how do you make it so it's easier for rescuers, whether it's your own boat or someone else, to actually locate you, find you, and basically successfully search for and locate you so that you can be rescued. So those individual and team drills address those techniques. Now, turning to another equipment area, heavy weather sails. So we'll have already talked about heavy weather conditions, that is the weather itself. But once you're in heavy weather conditions or it's coming, you're going to be probably breaking out some special equipment. That could be your mainsail having a very deep reefing configuration, or it could be a specialized replacement for your mainsail called the storm trysail. Similarly with your head sails, you may have a head sail configuration on your boat that's suitable for heavy weather, but most coastal boats are not set up with the right sails or equipment for heavy weather sailing. And so you'll learn about that equipment and additional specialized sails like heavy weather jibs. We'll talk about both the equipment and setup for those sails for heavy weather conditions, and we'll also talk about techniques to protect the sails, protect the boat, and make the boat manageable to sail through the heavy weather. Turning to damage control. There's a lot of different kinds of damage that can happen. You could have a partial or complete rig failure. You could have a flooding problem, whether that's flooding through the hull with damage to the hull or damage to through hull fittings, or it could be down flooding from being knocked down or swamped or capsized. And a very common problem in offshore conditions is having problems with the steering system. Yeah, everything from damage to rudders and damage to the mechanism that connects the rudder all the way up to your wheel or tiller. So you may be able to do damage control to jury rig your steering system. You may have to revert to some kind of secondary or emergency steering system. So we'll go through each of those topics and talk about the preparations you would do before you went on an offshore passage to make sure you had the right equipment, tools, parts, and know-how, and then the things you might do if damage actually occurs to make sure you can get the crew and the boat safely to port. Another area, and this is an area where we cover both theory and practical drills, emergency signals. So these can range all the way from traditional pyrotechnics or flares all the way through to modern electronic distress beacons. On emergency signals, we'll talk about the similarities and differences between things like GPS units, EPIRBs, and PLBs, or personal locator beacons. We'll do a practical drill with live flares. You'll see in the pictures here orange smoke and red flares. We train for training purposes in Canada. We use white flares, and so there's an actual training session where you'll go and learn about how to use a flare. You'll light flares and see how visible they are and how long they burn, and get an idea what it might be like to do that in more difficult conditions. So that's both the theory and practical drills on those signals. So just to come to a little bit of a summary on the offshore personal survival course, there's a wide range of topics covered. It's a 2-day course. It has a mix of classroom theory, practical drills in the water and outdoors. We do breakout groups, and we'll go through some accident reports and talk about the lessons learned from those accidents. You'll see and use either your real safety equipment or course-provided safety equipment like the life rafts. And for some of that equipment, it'll probably be the first time you've actually used the equipment in real use. I mean, it's not common to inflate life rafts for training purposes outside of a course environment. So you're probably going to come away from the course with a real sense that you've been drinking from a fire hose and that there's always more to learn. When you finish this particular course, you earn a course certificate that is accredited by Sail Canada and World Sailing. And these course certificates are portable to sailing events around the world. And they're good for 5 years from the date you took the training. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about 2 other kinds of specialized training quite briefly, and then we'll go to questions and discussion. So the first of the 2 is offshore weather and routing. I already mentioned that in a course that has to cover a wide range of topics and is delivered in 2 days, you can only go so deep on any topic, and weather's an example of that. So most sailors who are heading offshore will want to have at least somebody on the boat, at least one person, maybe more than one person on the boat, will want to have a deeper understanding of offshore weather and also offshore routing than they can get from a more general course. And so there are offshore weather courses offered. They're usually a couple days in duration at least. Some of them involve more study or a series of course modules. They, like this offshore personal survival course, usually assume that the person already has a working knowledge of coastal marine weather, and they provide an introduction to offshore and high seas weather. Some courses will also cover how to get that weather information onto the boat, and some courses will go on to cover how to do offshore route optimization, which these days is usually done with the assistance of a computer and software. The kinds of things that will get covered in a course like this, on the left-hand side of this chart is a chart-based forecast, or weather facts, as you might have heard it called. This is a traditional weather chart. It shows areas of low pressure, high pressure, fronts and ridges, and other significant weather features. It's done or prepared and signed off on by a human forecaster. On the right-hand side is a numerical model or a computer-based model, which isn't done by a human forecaster. And you may have heard these referred to as grid files. So in an offshore weather course, you're going to learn how to use weather facts, and in a modern course these days, you're probably going to learn how to use grid files as well, and then to develop a bit of an understanding of what are the similarities between those and what are the differences, because there are some very important differences. You'll cover things like how to not get in the path of a hurricane, a tropical storm or hurricane. And if that sounds like, well, of course I wouldn't get in the path of a hurricane. Well, sailboats offshore, a typical sailboat sailing offshore, when I say typical, a 35 to 50 foot sailboat sailing offshore will probably move about 120 to 200 nautical miles in 24 hours. And so that might be fast on the boat, but that's not very slow if the track of your boat and the track of a tropical storm are on a collision path. So there's some really good rules of thumb and information on how to look at tropical storm forecasts and make sure you give yourself ample safety room to not get anywhere near the dangerous areas of these weather features. Finally, routing. This screen is a quick example. The black parallel lines are barometric pressure lines that have been brought into a piece of computer software, and the multicolored lines with little arrows on them are a bunch of different possible routes the computer has calculated. And of course, to bring it back to sailing the boat, a human being on the boat has to decide, are we going down the purple or orange line? Are we going down the green or blue lines? Are we going somewhere else? Because the computer doesn't actually make the decisions for you. So an offshore weather course with a routing component will talk through those kinds of topics and decisions. Vic Maui, so where do you get this kind of training? Vic Maui offers an offshore weather and routing course. Blue Water Cruising Association chapters often organize these kinds of courses. Online, you can go to Northview. North Sails has an online and in-person educational program called Northview. And so they offer webinars which cover offshore weather and offshore routing. Specialized weather-oriented sailing or offshore weather-oriented organizations like StarPath also offer courses for offshore weather. So that's something probably not for every sailor going offshore, but for some of the people on every boat, somebody's got to know about this stuff. And first aid for offshore, that's the third and last of the type of formal training I'm going to touch on. Very briefly, I'll say there's, like so many things in training or in life, there's good, better, and best. And, you know, good training is somebody on the boats had first aid training at the basic level. If it's marine first aid training, that's good because it'll have more in depth on things like hypothermia and cold water immersion. In the better category, something longer than your standard 2-day first aid or marine basic first aid course is a good thing to think about for long offshore passages. Those programs tend to get to be 5 to 10 days long, so they're a very significant commitment of time and money. Again, this is an example of training that maybe one person on the boat, a couple people on the boat might have the basic training, and maybe one person has more advanced training. On good, better, best, if you have a paramedic, a nurse, a doctor who's a sailor and who wants to go offshore with you, or that already describes you, then that's a great situation to be in because you're going to have knowledge and capability on the boat that you wouldn't otherwise have. So what is different between a normal first aid course and a first aid course that's suitable for offshore? The real differences are that you're going to have a difference between onshore training, which is oriented towards urban environments, and offshore training, which you're not going to get, you know, if you call 911, and there's no actual 911, but if you call for medical assistance when you're hundreds of miles offshore, it's clearly not coming quickly. And so you're going to have to manage the situation on the boat for a longer period of time in an offshore situation than you would if you were sailing in coastal waters. Offshore-oriented first aid training will go into more depth on some specific topics, so going deeper on things like seasickness or hypothermia, and it will probably also provide field interventions beyond basic life support that you can use while you're waiting to get more assistance. For offshore, you'll have a more extensive medical kit and the better marine-oriented first aid programs will get into some details on that. And a key thing is, if you do get into problems offshore and you don't have on the boat all the capabilities that you would have if you were at home and with access to hospitals and primary, secondary care, you need to know how to get remote medical support. So this is the process of you're on the boat and so's the person who's injured or ill, and you use communications to get in touch with specialized resources who are trained and provide medical advice without actually being on the boat with you. So they help bridge the gap between the expertise and ability you have on your boat and the eventual arrival of outside help that can do more than what you can do on the boat. So those are the kind of things you should expect that would be different in an offshore-oriented first aid program. With that, I'll just make a couple closing remarks. Training and pandemics. So this kind of training, as I've gone over, the offshore personal survival training in particular, is a combination of classroom theory, practical hands-on sessions, breakout groups, and so on. It's probably fair to say that you won't be doing a lot of social distancing in a life raft. And so this kind of training, most training providers suspended this kind of training after the onset of the pandemic, and it's been suspended through all of 2020. Current plans for the offshore training community are to get this class of training resumed during 2021 as conditions permit. So it may resume in different places at different times. And as that training gets resumed, people will be able to do the training in advance of heading off for events later in 2021 or full year 2022. And so just to wrap that up, then here's the information screen where you can get more information on offshore personal survival training here in British Columbia. And if you're elsewhere in Canada, we've provided that link as well. I'd like to, at this point, wrap up there and turn it over to you and our moderator to give us some questions.
All right, if anyone has any questions for David, be sure to drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And while we wait for those, are there any frequently asked questions you usually get with this presentation, David?
Well, one of the questions I've been getting recently is for people that already hold an offshore personal survival training certificate. I mentioned they're valid for 5 years. As offshore events get underway again, some people's certificates will have expired during 2020 or may be expiring imminently. And until the training's fully available again, what do people do? And so I could tell you that in Canada, Sail Canada has set up a offshore prescription so that the various events that go offshore and require this class of training, the event organizers can continue to recognize the training and certificates for a while beyond the original expiry dates. So that's a common question. Hopefully that gives you an answer on that. I see more questions coming up in Q&A. Maybe I'll read in a question from Vanessa. She's asking, is the offshore personal survival course the same as the offshore safety at sea course? This kind of training in the US is usually called safety at sea. In Canada, because we're close to the US, it's often called safety at sea. Around the world, World Sailing and many of the sailing authorities around the world refer to this class of training as offshore personal survival training. And so if you're looking at a course that's sounds like any of those and you want to know whether they meet the same world sailing requirements, you just have to ask the course provider if the course is accredited as an offshore personal survival course by the national authority, and in Canada that's Sail Canada. If you click on the link that's on the screen right now, the Sail Canada link, it gives a list of the accredited training organizations and contact information for each of them. So you can see who's accredited to offer this training in Canada and link to them and see what they have to offer. Hopefully that addresses that one.
All right, that looks like all we've got for the time being, but we do have a few more minutes here. So if people have any more questions, be sure to drop them in the Q&A box there. Is there anything else you wanted to add to your presentation, David?
I think, well, I covered what I wanted to cover, of course, in the time, but we're always a bit time limited. I see a question coming in here from Randy. He or she says, it seems like this training would be good for coastal cruisers, or is it overkill? So I can tell you that about 1/3 of the people that take this training in BC are cruisers rather than racers. And of those, of that 1/3 of the people who take the training, I'd say they're roughly evenly split between people who are actually headed offshore and people who are adventurous local cruisers and who want to get a more advanced level of training than they previously had. So I don't think the training's overkill for coastal cruisers if you're planning things like trips around Vancouver Island, up to the Central Coast, up to Alaska, maybe to Haida Gwaii. If you're just planning to sail in coastal waters close to the South Coast, like Gulf Islands, Howe Sound, Sunshine Coast, yeah, this kind of program may be more than you really want or need. And you might want to look at a shorter course like the 1-day Safety at Sea course that's outlined on the BC Courses webpage. Question from Jeremy on typically what does a course like this cost? So the Offshore Personal Survival course in BC costs between $300 and $400. There are discounts usually offered for registering early. And if you're somebody who's taken the training before and you're renewing your training, there's usually a discount offered for that as well. In other parts of Canada and in other areas around the world, the training is often priced higher than the numbers I just described. But we've in BC, we've been holding the price into the $300 to $400 range.
All right. Do you have any closing remarks, David, that you would like to add to your presentation while you've got a few minutes?
Yeah, well, I would like to thank the Boat Show organization for setting up the seminar program this year as a virtual program along with the rest of the boat show. Of course, with the pandemic's affected all kinds of organizations and access to things like offshore survival training. I'm very appreciative, and both BC Sailing and Sail Canada are very appreciative of the support from the boat show to make these seminars accessible. And thank you for that. I think unless there's any other questions, that's really covered it all.
Perfect. All right. I think that will bring us to the end of our presentation here. I want to thank you, David, for your time, as well as thank everyone at home for watching. And I want to let you know that if you are interested in giving feedback on the seminar or giving us any ideas for topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future, there is a evaluate tab located above the seminar description that you can click to fill out the form and let us know your thoughts. After the show, all attendees will also receive a post-show survey, so be sure to fill that out. You'll also want to check out all the other features here at VIBS Virtual, and I want to thank our sponsor, Freedom Marine International Yacht Sales. If you have any questions, be sure to swing by the info booth for some answers, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your time here at the boat show. We're here for the rest of the day and tomorrow. Once again, David, thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, and everyone have fun at the show.
Take care.